After my husband's death, I found an old envelope in the basement. Inside was a key, an address, and a note. "Don't tell our children. This is only for you." I went to that address alone. That's when I learned the whole truth about our children and what they had done. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. The house on Maple Creek Road had always smelled like coffee and wood polish. For 41 years, that smell meant home. It meant Harold sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, pretending he wasn't doing the crossword puzzle when he absolutely was. It meant Saturday mornings with the radio on low, the neighbor's dog barking at nothing, and the particular quality of Ohio light coming through the kitchen window, pale gold and unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people call me Peggy. I was 68 years old when my husband died, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about my own life. Harold and I had built something quiet and decent together. He'd worked 30 years as an engineer for a manufacturing company in Columbus, commuted an hour each way without complaint, and retired with a modest pension and enough savings that we never had to worry. I had taught elementary school for 22 years. We weren't wealthy people, but we were careful people. The house was paid off. We had IRAs, a savings account, a small brokerage account. Harold managed himself. He kept meticulous records in green ledger books he stored in the basement filing cabinet. We had 2 children. Our daughter, Carol, lived in Portland with her husband and 3 kids. She called every Sunday, visited at Thanksgiving, remembered birthdays. Our son, Daniel, lived 12 minutes away in the same town where he'd grown up. He worked in real estate, had his own small agency, Calloway Property Group. He'd always had Harold's head for numbers, or so we thought. Daniel's wife, Krista, was a compact, efficient woman who smiled with only the front part of her face. I'd never been able to explain what unsettled me about her. Harold had once said she reminded him of a calculator. Fast, precise, and utterly indifferent to the feelings of the person using it. I told him that wasn't fair. I believed that then. Harold died in February. A stroke, quiet and sudden, in the middle of the night. One moment he was beside me, and then he wasn't. The grief was total. A complete reorganization of the world. Everything I did for those first months was done in his absence, which meant everything felt slightly wrong, like furniture moved 2 inches from where it belonged. Daniel and Krista stepped in immediately. That was how it felt at the time, like stepping in. They helped with the funeral arrangements, the thank you notes, the flood of paperwork that follows a death. Daniel said he'd handle the financial accounts, just to make sure everything transferred cleanly. I was grateful. I was exhausted. I said yes to everything. The first strange thing happened in April. I called the bank to ask about transferring some funds for a repair on the back porch. Nothing significant, $2,000. And the representative paused in a way that made my stomach drop. She said there'd been some recent activity on the account and asked if I wanted to review it. I said yes. The balance was $40,000 lower than I expected. When I asked Daniel about it, he had an answer ready. Investment reallocation, he said. He and Harold had discussed moving some funds into a real estate trust for better tax management. He'd forgotten to mention it because there'd been so much going on. He showed me a document on his phone, small print, official looking, and I felt embarrassed for having asked. He was my son. Harold had trusted him, but something stayed with me. A low hum of wrongness I couldn't name. In June, I finally went down to the basement to begin sorting Harold's files. I'd been putting it off. It felt too much like an ending. The basement was cool and smelled like concrete and old cardboard, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before I turned on the light. Harold's filing cabinet was in the corner, a gray 4-drawer unit he'd had since before we were married. The top drawer held tax returns going back to 1987. The second held insurance documents. The third was household records. Warranties, repair receipts, utility histories. The fourth drawer was usually empty. Harold kept it as overflow. It wasn't empty. At the very back of the fourth drawer, tucked beneath a folded piece of canvas, was a plain white envelope. No name on the front. Just sealed. Sitting there like it had been waiting. Inside was a brass key, small and ordinary looking, the kind that opens a safe deposit box. There was a handwritten note on a folded piece of paper in Harold's careful engineer's print. An address, not a bank, but a street address on the east side of Columbus. And below it, 11 words. Don't tell our children. This is only for you. I sat down on the basement floor and read it again. And again. What had Harold known? What had he been afraid of? And why? After 41 years of telling each other everything, had he kept a secret? Only death could deliver. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table where Harold used to do his crosswords, and I laid out what I had. 1 key, 1 address, 1 sentence written in a dead man's handwriting. The brass key had no markings except a number stamped into the bow. 114. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was too small for that. Safe deposit, I was almost certain. The address Harold had written was on Fenwick Street in Columbus. I didn't know what was there. I didn't let myself look it up. Not yet. I needed to think clearly, and I couldn't think clearly until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. The next morning, I called my bank, not the branch Daniel usually dealt with, the main branch downtown, where I'd banked since 1981. I asked to speak with someone in account services and said I wanted a complete transaction history for all joint accounts going back 18 months. The woman on the phone was professional and kind, and she said I could come in and review everything in person. I made an appointment for Thursday. I did not tell Daniel. That felt significant. Choosing not to tell my son something felt like an act of aggression, like stepping off a curb into traffic. I kept second-guessing myself all through Wednesday. Maybe the $40,000 discrepancy was innocent. Maybe Harold had genuinely discussed it with Daniel. Maybe I was a grieving old woman constructing a conspiracy out of grief and confusion. But Harold's note said, "Don't tell our children." Harold was not a dramatic man. He did not leave cryptic messages. If he'd written those words, he had a reason. Thursday morning, I drove myself to the bank. I sat across from a young accounts manager named Patricia, and together, we went through 18 months of statements. What I found took my breath away. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. Quietly, the way cold water feels when you step into it before your body has adjusted. There had been a series of transfers beginning 8 months before Harold died, the last 8 months of his life when he'd been in declining health and spending more time in bed. 11 transfers in total, ranging from $6,000 to $45,000 each. They had all gone into a business account, Callaway Property Group, Daniel's company. The total was $260,000. Patricia was careful with her expression. She explained that the transfers had been authorized. Harold's signature was on the original account agreement that gave Daniel secondary access for estate planning purposes. That agreement had been added to the account 14 months ago. "Did your husband add this authorization himself?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. And that was the truth. I drove home slowly. I had to pull over twice, Once because I couldn't stop shaking, and once because I was crying so hard I couldn't see the road. Then I sat in a gas station parking lot on Route 40, and I made myself be still. $260,000. That was not a misunderstanding. That was not an investment reallocation. That was the money Harold and I had spent 40 years building together. His pension contributions, my teacher's salary savings, the careful compound interest of a careful life. And it had flowed month by month into our son's business account, while Harold was too ill to fully track it. Was Harold aware? Had Daniel manipulated a sick man? Or had Harold set up that account access willingly, trusting his son, and Daniel had quietly taken advantage of it? The note in the basement suggested Harold had known something was wrong. But how much had he known? And when? I thought about Krista. Her efficient smile. The way she always seemed to be calculating something just behind her eyes. Real estate was Daniel's name, but Krista managed the books. Everyone in town knew that. I sat in that parking lot until the shaking stopped. And then, somewhere between the grief and the rage, something else appeared. A cold, clarifying determination. I was 68 years old. I had taught 237 children to read. I had buried my husband. I had lived quietly and carefully for decades, and I was not going to let two people dismantle what Harold and I had built without a single consequence. My first plan was simple. 3 steps. 1. Find out what was at the Fenwick Street address. 2. Talk to a lawyer, not a family friend, someone Daniel didn't know. 3. Do all of it without alerting Daniel or Krista until I was ready. I was done being grateful for their help. I was done being managed. I went home, I made a pot of coffee, and I opened Harold's green ledger books. The ones I'd never had reason to look at closely, because Harold had always handled the finances. And I began to read. The address on Fenwick Street turned out to be a UPS store. I drove to Columbus on a Tuesday, when I knew Daniel had client meetings. He always posted his schedule to the family Google Calendar, a habit Krista had started years ago to coordinate family visits. I'd never thought about how much information that gave me. Now I was grateful for every detail. The UPS store was a plain, fluorescent-lit space between a nail salon and a dry cleaner. A young man with a beard was working the counter. I showed him the key and told him my husband had passed and I was trying to locate his mailbox. He looked up the box number, 114, found the account under Harold's name, and asked for my ID and the death certificate I'd brought on instinct. Harold had added me to the account as a co-holder 7 years ago. The young man handed me a small cardboard box from the back shelf without ceremony. I carried it to my car and sat in the parking lot with the box in my lap. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed. Inside the envelope was a second envelope, which held a thumb drive and 3 pages of handwritten notes in Harold's print. The notes were dated. The earliest was 13 months ago. The most recent was 6 weeks before he died. I read them twice in the parking lot, and by the time I finished, my hands were completely steady. Sometimes clarity has a physical effect. Harold had known, not everything, not the full $260,000, but he'd become suspicious when Daniel asked him to sign the secondary account authorization. Harold had thought it was for estate planning, as Daniel claimed. But then he'd noticed a transfer he hadn't approved, a withdrawal of $22,000 that appeared on a statement he happened to open himself. He'd confronted Daniel, and Daniel had explained it away. But Harold, careful, methodical Harold, had started keeping notes. The notes documented 5 suspicious transfers he'd identified before his health declined too sharply to track the statements. He'd written down dates, amounts, and Daniel's explanations for each. He'd written, "I don't want to believe this, But I have to be honest with myself. I have to protect Peggy. The thumb drive, I found out when I got home and plugged it in, contained scanned copies of 13 bank statements, 3 signed authorization documents, and a recorded phone conversation. Harold had recorded a phone call with Daniel 9 months ago, during which Daniel had pressured him to sign over power of attorney for convenience, and Harold had asked why that was necessary when he wasn't incapacitated, and Daniel had said, "I listened to it 4 times. Dad, you need to start thinking realistically about what happens when you can't manage this yourself. Krista and I are already doing most of it." That was the moment Harold had understood. I sat at my kitchen table with the thumb drive in my hand and thought, my husband died knowing his son had stolen from him, and he spent his last months quietly building a case to protect me. He couldn't confront Daniel openly. He was sick. He was tired, and he didn't want to shatter the family while he was still in it. But he'd left me a key. He'd left me a map. I drove to Columbus the next day and met with an attorney named Susan Hargrove, whom I found through the Ohio State Bar Association's referral service specifically because she had no connection to our town, Daniel's business, or anyone we knew. Her office was on the 12th floor of a building downtown, and she was 62, direct, and unimpressed by nothing. I laid out everything on her conference table: the ledger books, the bank statements, the handwritten notes, the thumb drive. She listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, what you're describing is elder financial abuse under Ohio Revised Code 2913.02. It's a felony. Do you want to pursue this criminally, civilly, or both?" I said, "Both." That same week, Daniel called me on a Wednesday evening. The call was casual. Too casual. He asked how I was doing, mentioned he'd noticed I'd visited the bank, said he just wanted to make sure I wasn't confused about any of the financial arrangements. He used that word, confused. I told him I was fine. I was just getting organized. There was a pause, and in that pause I heard Krista's voice in the background, low and quick, asking something I couldn't make out. "Okay, Mom," Daniel said in a tone I recognized, the tone adults use with people they've decided not to take seriously. "Let us know if you need anything." I said I would. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. They had noticed something. They weren't sure what, but the wheels had begun turning on their side. I had perhaps a few weeks before they understood the shape of what was coming. It was enough. It had to be. Susan filed the civil complaint on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Daniel knew. He didn't call. He came to the house. I heard the car in the driveway. The particular sound of Daniel's Audi, which I had always found slightly too expensive for a man running a small-town real estate agency. Krista was with him. I watched them come up the porch steps from the kitchen window, and I noticed they were walking quickly, close together, the way people walk when they've agreed on something before they arrived. I opened the door before they knocked. Daniel's face was doing something I hadn't seen before. A kind of controlled alarm, the expression of a man who has realized the ground has shifted and is trying to recalculate his footing. Krista's face was simpler. She was angry. "Mom," Daniel said, "can we come in?" "Of course," I said. "I'll put on coffee." We sat at the kitchen table, and I let them begin. Daniel said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the transfers from Harold's account had all been done with Harold's knowledge and approval. He said he had documentation. He said he was hurt. That word, hurt. That I'd gone to a lawyer instead of coming to him first. That I was treating this like a legal matter when it's a family matter. Krista said nothing yet. She was watching me with those calculating eyes, reading me, trying to determine how much I knew. I kept my hands around my coffee cup and let Daniel finish. Then I said, "Daniel, your father recorded a phone call 9 months before he died. In it, you pressured him to sign over power of attorney while he was still legally competent and making his own financial decisions. And then there are 11 transfers to your business account totaling $260,000, the majority of which your father did not authorize. Susan Hargrove has copies of everything. So does the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. As of yesterday morning, the room went very quiet. Daniel's face changed. The controlled alarm cracked, and underneath it was something uglier, something cornered. "You had no right to go through Dad's things," he said. His voice had changed too, flatter. "Those financial decisions were made for the benefit of the whole family. You don't understand how estate planning works. You never did." "I understand $260,000, I said. Krista finally spoke. She leaned forward, and her voice was precise and cold. "Margaret, think about what you're doing. You're an old woman living alone. You don't have the energy for a legal battle that could take years. And Daniel is your son. Do you understand what it will look like when this goes public? The whole town will know. Your grandchildren will know. Carol will know. Is that what you want for this family?" There it was. The shape of the threat, clean and plain. Your isolation, your age, your love for your family, the social consequences, the exhaustion of a fight. She'd assessed my weaknesses and walked straight to them. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Krista, Harold spent the last year of his life quietly building a record to protect me from exactly this conversation. I intend to honor that." Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped back. "This is insane," he said. "You're going to destroy this family over money, over paperwork." "You destroyed something first," I said quietly. "Please leave my house." They left. Krista walked out without another word. Daniel paused in the doorway and said, "You'll regret this," in a voice that wasn't quite a threat, but was close enough to one that my hands started shaking after the door closed. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called Carol in Portland, and I told her everything. Carol was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. What do you need?" "I need a few days," I said. "And then I need you to trust me." I spent the next 4 days doing almost nothing. I walked in the mornings, I read in the afternoons, I watered Harold's tomato plants in the back garden, which had somehow survived without him, reaching toward the sun with total indifference to everything that had happened. I let Susan handle the filings. I didn't answer Daniel's call, there were 4 of them. And I didn't read the text messages. I had done what needed doing. Now I needed to be still. The offer came by email, routed through Daniel's own attorney, a man named Garrett Foss, whom I recognized as a golf partner of Daniel's and who had, I noted, absolutely no business practicing in estate litigation. The offer was this. Daniel would return $120,000, roughly half of what had been taken, in exchange for my signing a release of all civil and criminal claims. The letter framed this as a good faith gesture toward family reconciliation. It used the phrase, "what Harold would have wanted," twice. I read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, forwarded it to Susan, and then went out to the garden. What Harold would have wanted. Harold would have wanted to die without knowing his son had been stealing from him for the better part of a year. Harold would have wanted to go to sleep on a Tuesday night and wake up on Wednesday. What Harold had actually wanted, in the circumstances he was given, was recorded carefully on a thumb drive in a cardboard box in a UPS store on Fenwick Street in Columbus. And it was not a $120,000 settlement. Susan's response to Garrett Foss was brief and professional. Her client declined and would see them in court. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at the end of my driveway. Not at the door, at the end of the driveway, standing beside his car as though he'd pulled over by accident. I was deadheading the roses along the front fence, and I saw him. He looked thinner. There were shadows under his eyes. He called out, "Mom, I just want to talk." "We can talk through our attorneys," I said, and went back to the roses. He stood there for another minute. Then he got back in his car and drove away. I understood what they were doing. They were watching me, assessing whether I was weakening, whether the isolation and the legal pressure and the simple strangeness of being at war with my own child was wearing me down. They were waiting for a crack. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 4 days getting stronger, not weaker. And what had helped most was people. My neighbor Ruth had noticed the cars coming and going. Ruth was 74, a retired nurse, and had the observational gifts of someone who'd spent decades monitoring patients. She came over with a casserole and sat at my kitchen table and didn't say a word until I'd told her the whole story. Then she said, "Peggy, I always thought that Krista was trouble." It was not the most nuanced assessment, but it was exactly what I needed to hear from someone who'd known me for 30 years. My friend Dolores from church, who had gone through a guardianship battle with her own siblings over her mother's estate, connected me with a local elder law advocacy group in Columbus, a nonprofit that provided paralegal support, emotional counseling, and, crucially, a network of people who had been through exactly this kind of case. I attended my first meeting that Thursday. There were 9 people in that room. 6 of them were women, all of them over 60, all of them dealing with versions of the same betrayal. I am not a woman who cries easily in public. I cried in that room. The advocate, a woman named Teresa, told me something that rearranged my thinking. She said, "The system is built to make you feel like the burden of proof is yours, and the cost of the fight is yours, and the damage to the family is yours. None of that is true. The person who commits the act carries the damage. You're just the one making sure the accounting is accurate." The accounting is accurate. I kept thinking about that phrase. Susan called the next day to say the court had issued a preliminary asset freeze on Callaway Property Group's business accounts pending the civil suit. Daniel could not move or transfer funds until the case was resolved. I heard this news sitting in the same chair where Harold used to read, and I thought, "We're doing this, Harold. We're doing this." I was not naive. I knew difficult weeks were still ahead. But for the first time since February, I didn't feel alone. They came on a Sunday. Carol had flown in from Portland the day before. She'd taken a week off work, said she wasn't letting me do this alone. She was in the living room when the knock came, and I saw something in her face when I said it was Daniel's car. A tightening around the eyes, the look of someone preparing for something unpleasant. I told her to stay in the living room. She didn't like that, but she stayed. Daniel and Krista had brought flowers, white hydrangeas in a paper sleeve from the grocery store. Krista was dressed carefully, not the efficient clothes she usually wore, but something softer, a cardigan in a pale blue. Daniel had shaved. They had prepared for this visit the way people prepare for a performance. "Mom," Daniel said. He looked at me with an expression I recognized from his childhood, a rehearsed sincerity, the face he used when he'd broken something and wanted to minimize consequences. "We needed to come and see you, not as a legal thing, as your family." I stepped back to let them in. I did not offer coffee. We stood in the living room. Carol came in from the hallway, and Daniel's expression flickered. He hadn't expected her. Krista's didn't change at all. She simply noted Carol's presence the way you note a piece of furniture. Registered, cataloged, dismissed. "Carol, I'm glad you're here," Daniel said, adjusting quickly, wrapping Carol into the performance. "Mom needs her family around her right now, not lawyers. That's actually what we want to talk about." He said they'd been thinking. He said they understood that the last several months had been emotionally overwhelming for me, and that grief did things to people, made them paranoid, made them see things that weren't there. He said Harold had wanted the family to be taken care of, that he'd shared that vision with Daniel, and that everything Daniel had done was in service of that vision. He said the word confused again. Then Krista spoke. She sat down without being invited and folded her hands on her knee and looked at me with something that was meant to appear compassionate. Margaret, you've been alone since February. That's hard for anyone. The mind starts to fill in gaps. Harold was sick for a long time, and I think somewhere in your grief you've decided that what happened with the finances must have been malicious, because that's easier to hold on to than the pain of losing him. It was genuinely skillful. A different woman, on a different day, might have wavered. What you've done, she continued, is put our children, your grandchildren, in the position of watching their father's name dragged through a legal proceeding. Patrick is 14. He's asked us why Grandma is suing Daddy. Can you imagine answering that? There was Patrick. She'd saved him for the middle, the most precise strike. I noticed Carol shift in her seat. She was gripping the armrest of the chair with both hands, and I could see the effort it was taking her to stay quiet. She was 39 years old, and she had her father's discipline when she needed it. She was using it now. I let Krista finish. I let the silence sit for a moment after she did. I had learned in those months that silence unsettles people who are performing. They need a response to push against. Take the response away, and the performance starts to feel exposed. Then I said, Krista, the court-ordered asset freeze on Daniel's business accounts is not a product of my grief. It's a product of $260,000 in unauthorized transfers, a recorded phone conversation, and Harold's written notes, which he kept for the last year of his life specifically because he knew this conversation would happen and he wanted me to be able to have it from a position of fact rather than feeling. The room was quiet. As for Patrick, I said, when he's old enough, I'll tell him exactly what happened, and I'll show him that it's possible to do the right thing even when it's the hardest thing. I think that's a better lesson than the alternative. Krista stood up. The cardigan and the soft expression were gone. What was underneath was harder and colder, and, I thought, more honest. You're making a catastrophic mistake, she said. You don't have any idea how much this is going to cost you. Legal fees alone will eat through whatever Harold left you, and don't think the county prosecutor has unlimited time for an old woman's family dispute. That last phrase, old woman's family dispute, was deliberate. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to feel like a nuisance rather than a plaintiff. My attorney is working on contingency for the civil portion, I said, and the criminal case is being handled by the county. They seem to find the time. Something shifted in Krista's face. The first moment where calculation became something raw. She had not known about the contingency agreement. That had cost her something. Daniel looked at me and he seemed, for just a moment, not like a man running a scheme, but like a boy who had done something very wrong a long time ago and had been trying to outrun it ever since. There was a flash of something. Not quite shame, but its shadow. The kind of look you see when someone realizes the gap between who they intended to be and who they became. Then it closed over, and they left. I locked the door. Carol came and put her arm around me and didn't say anything for a moment. My heart was going fast, and my legs felt strange, the particular tremble of adrenaline wearing off. I was afraid. I won't pretend I wasn't. Krista's threat about legal costs had landed even though I'd answered it. The dismissal, old woman's family dispute, had landed too, in a place I hadn't expected it to reach. But fear I had discovered, was not the opposite of courage. It was the texture of it. It burned clean, and it burned steady. And it kept me moving forward when moving forward was the hardest thing I had ever done. The civil deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday in October. Susan had spent 2 months preparing. So had Garrett Foss, Daniel's attorney, though I suspected he'd spent more of those 2 months billing Daniel than working. The deposition would be taken at Susan's office in Columbus, in a conference room with cream-colored walls and a window overlooking a parking garage, which is where consequential things often happen, in ordinary rooms with unremarkable views. Carol drove me. We didn't talk much on the way. The highway was flat and gray, the Ohio farmland on either side stripped down to stubble after the harvest, and the sky was the particular washed-out blue of late autumn. I wore Harold's favorite color on me. A dark green cardigan, he used to say, made me look like a school principal, which he meant as a compliment. I'd pressed it the night before. It seemed important to be neat. Daniel and Krista arrived separately from Garrett Foss and sat together at the far end of the conference table. Daniel looked like he hadn't been sleeping. There were shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there in the summer. Krista was dressed precisely and sat straight, but I noticed her jaw was set in a way that suggested she'd been clenching her teeth. The asset freeze had been in place for 6 weeks. I'd learned from Teresa's advocacy group that 3 of Daniel's ongoing property deals had collapsed because the freeze had made his business account inaccessible to escrow transactions. The financial pressure had been doing its work. Susan walked Daniel through the transfers methodically, each one date by date, amount by amount. She presented bank statements. She presented the authorization document. She asked Daniel, under oath, whether Harold had been aware of each transfer at the time it occurred. Daniel said yes. Consistently, stubbornly, yes. Susan nodded. She asked whether Harold had ever expressed confusion or concern about his financial accounts in the months before he died. Daniel said no. Harold had been fully informed and engaged. Susan said, "Mr. Calloway, I'm going to play a recording." She pressed play on a laptop, and Harold's voice filled the room. I had heard the recording 4 times. I knew every word. But hearing Harold's voice in that room, careful, tired, a little slower than I remembered from before the illness, but still absolutely his voice, still the voice that had said good morning to me for 41 years, was something I hadn't prepared for fully. Something moved through my chest like a current. I kept my face still. I kept my hands flat on the table. I let myself hear him. On the recording, Harold asked Daniel why he needed power of attorney when Harold could still manage his own affairs, and Daniel said, and this was the moment Susan had built to, the seam in the whole structure, "Dad, I need to be able to act quickly on some of these property moves. You can't always be reached, and timing matters in real estate. Just sign it and don't worry about it." "Don't worry about it," Susan said, stopping the playback. "Mr. Calloway, your father has just expressed on this recording that he is uncertain about the purpose of the power of attorney. You told him not to worry about it. Is that consistent with your statement that your father was fully informed and engaged with all financial decisions?" Garrett Foss objected to the characterization. Susan rephrased and asked again. Daniel said, "He understood the overall plan." "The overall plan," Susan repeated. She let the phrase sit in the room for a moment, the way a good teacher lets a wrong answer sit. Not to humiliate, but to let it become visible. "Can you describe that plan for us specifically, including when each of the 11 transfers was discussed with Harold?" And here is where it came apart. Because Harold's notes, which Susan had introduced as exhibits, documented not 11 transfers, but 8. The 3 largest transfers totaling $140,000, had occurred after Harold's health had deteriorated to the point where he was spending most of his time in bed, in the final 2 months before his death. They were not in Harold's notes. There were no records of conversations about them. There were no emails, no texts, no documented discussions of any kind. Daniel knew this. He'd known it coming in. But knowing something and managing it under sustained, methodical questioning, in a room with a court reporter and a recording device, and an attorney who had spent 2 months doing nothing but preparing for exactly this, are entirely different things. He began to contradict himself. He said Harold had authorized the transfers verbally. When Susan asked who had witnessed those conversations, he named Krista. When Susan turned and asked Krista directly, she would be deposed separately, but Susan asked a preliminary question. Krista said Daniel had handled all financial discussions with Harold directly, and she hadn't been present. She said it without hesitation, without looking at Daniel. I watched Daniel's face when Krista said it. Something happened there that I will carry for the rest of my life. Not with satisfaction, but with a kind of sorrow I hadn't expected. He had trusted her to hold the line, and she had stepped away from it cleanly, in a single sentence, and left him standing alone in the gap. Your own wife, Susan said, with complete neutrality, has just stated she was not present for any of the financial discussions you've cited as verbal authorization. Who else can corroborate these conversations? Daniel looked at Garrett Foss. Garrett Foss looked at his notes. No one answered. I sat across the table from my son, and I did not feel triumph. I didn't feel hate. I felt something quieter and harder. The satisfaction of a ledger that was finally being made accurate. The way Harold would have wanted it. Number by number. Line by line. The truth given back its proper shape. The deposition lasted 4 hours. When it was done, and the court reporter had packed up and Garrett Foss had gathered his papers with the careful movements of a man who knows he is lost, Daniel stood and looked at me across the table. His face had the open, unguarded quality of someone whose composure has completely left them. He looked younger. He looked for the first time in months like my son rather than my adversary. He said, "Mom, we're done for today, Daniel," Susan said. We were. The civil case settled in February, exactly 1 year after Harold died. It didn't go to trial in the end. 3 weeks after the deposition, Garrett Foss contacted Susan with a new offer. Full restitution. $260,000 returned in total, plus interest calculated at the statutory rate, plus Susan's legal fees in their entirety. In exchange, Daniel and Krista would not contest the civil judgment. No admissions of liability were required, as is standard, but the payment itself was a fact, and facts have their own language. Susan called me with the offer on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in Harold's garden, where his tomato plants had long since gone to ground, and I'd put in winter pansies instead, purple and white, because Harold had always said pansies were underestimated flowers. I was kneeling in the cold dirt with my gardening gloves on when my phone rang. "It's a clean win," Susan said. "Full amount, no negotiation on the number." "What about the criminal matter?" I asked. "That's separate," she said. "The DA's office will proceed regardless of the civil settlement. That's not yours to drop. You handed them the evidence. The case belongs to the state now." That was right. That was how it should be. I told Susan to accept. We stayed on the phone a moment longer, and she said something I've thought about many times since. "Mrs. Calloway, I've handled a lot of these cases. Most of them don't end here. You built an unusually solid record." I knew what she meant. Harold had built it. I had only had the presence of mind to follow the map he left. The money arrived by wire transfer on a Monday morning in March. I sat in the kitchen and watched the bank notification come through on my phone, and I stayed there for a while in the quiet. The number on the screen was the number Harold and I had built over 40 years of careful living. The compound interest of a decent life returned. Outside, it had started to snow. The soft, uncertain snow of late winter, the kind that can't decide whether to commit. Harold had always loved that snow. He used to stand at the back door and watch it with his coffee, not saying anything, just watching. The criminal proceedings moved more slowly, as criminal proceedings do. Daniel was charged with 1 count of theft from a person in a protected class under Ohio Revised Code 2913.02 and 1 count of misuse of power of attorney. Krista was charged as an accessory, on the basis that she had managed the books at Callaway Property Group and had signed off on the incoming transfers without flagging them or requiring documentation. Her silence, the prosecutor's office determined, had not been passive. It had been functional. They entered not guilty pleas, as expected. Their attorney, they'd hired a proper criminal defense attorney by then, someone competent, someone who hadn't spent 15 years playing golf with Daniel. Negotiated for months. In the end, Daniel pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misdemeanor theft in exchange for full cooperation with the court's financial accounting. He received 2 years probation, mandatory financial restitution he'd already paid under the civil settlement, and a permanent ban from serving as a fiduciary, power of attorney, trustee, executor, for any Ohio resident. That last condition was the one I cared most about. It meant he could never do this to anyone else. Not to a sick parent, not to an elderly neighbor, not to anyone who trusted him with the accumulated weight of their life. The court had drawn a line around him, and I found that right. Krista's charge was reduced and dismissed in exchange for her testimony corroborating the timeline. She confirmed, on the record, that she had been aware the final 3 transfers occurred after Harold was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. She said Daniel had told her it was technically within the authorization document. She said she hadn't asked further questions. I don't know whether she was telling the truth about how little she'd known. I'm not sure it matters now. The record existed, the accounting was accurate, and whatever private calculation Krista made in that moment, whether it was remorse or self-preservation or something in between, it produced the result that the truth was spoken aloud in a courthouse, under oath. The day Daniel's plea was entered, Carol called me from Portland. She'd been following the proceedings through the court filing system online. She said, "Mom, are you okay?" "I think so," I said. "I think I'm something more than okay." I stayed on the phone with Carol for a long time that evening. We talked about Harold. Real talking. The kind we hadn't quite managed in the year of grief and legal proceedings. Carol said she remembered the way he used to hum while he cooked. Always slightly off-key, always completely unaware of it. I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in a long time. The sound surprised me. I'm not sure I can name exactly what I felt that day. It was not happiness exactly. It was not closure exactly. Closure is a word invented by people who haven't experienced real loss, because real loss doesn't close. It integrates. It becomes part of the structure of who you are. What I felt was something more like the sensation of having balanced a very long equation. The sense that the numbers now added up to what they should have been all along, that Harold's careful record-keeping had not been in vain, that the last year of his life, which I had grieved as a year of illness and loss, had also been a year of love and protection, quietly given. He had known he was leaving me. He had made sure I'd be all right. I sold the house on Maple Creek Road in June. not because I had to. The money had been returned, and I was financially stable for the first time in over a year. I sold it because I was ready. 41 years of a good life had happened inside those walls, and those years were complete. I didn't need to live inside a completed thing. I needed to live inside something still unfolding. I bought a smaller house in a town called Granville, 40 minutes east of Columbus, near Denison University, where students walked the streets at all hours and the coffee shops stayed open late, and there was a farmer's market on Saturday mornings that Harold would have found entirely too enthusiastic, and I found wonderful. The house had a garden with established perennial beds, hostas and black-eyed Susans, and a climbing rose along the back fence. It had good southern light. It had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs, one of which I sat in every morning with my coffee. The empty chair didn't feel like absence after a while. It felt like space. Some mornings, I thought about Harold. I talked to him sometimes, in the garden, when no one was around to hear. I told him about the climbing rose. I told him the pansies had come back. I think he would have appreciated the sentiment more than the accuracy, which is saying something, because Harold appreciated accuracy enormously. I joined the elder law advocacy group as a volunteer that autumn. Teresa put me to work almost immediately. Financial elder abuse is not rare. It is common and quiet, and it happens most often within families, which is why it so rarely gets reported. I accompanied 3 women to their initial attorney consultations in the first year. Each of them came in the way I had, shaking slightly, apologizing for taking up space, prefacing everything with, "I might be wrong, but..." I recognized that posture. I had worn it. I sat with a 71-year-old named Beverly, who was shaking so hard she could barely hold her papers. Her son-in-law had been quietly transferring funds from her late husband's pension account for 8 months. I put my hand over hers and told her, "You built something real, and you have every right to protect it." The shaking slowed. Beverly won her case 14 months later. She sent me a card with pansies on the front. It's still on my refrigerator. Carol visited in September and said I seemed different. "More like yourself," she said, "but a self I haven't seen in a while." I thought, maybe this is a self that needed the last 2 years to exist. That's not a justification for what Daniel and Krista did. It's simply an honest accounting of what came out the other side. I took a watercolor class on Thursday evenings. I was terrible at it. My colors went muddy. My trees looked like something a child would apologize for. I went back every week. By summer, I had painted a passable version of the climbing rose. I framed it and put it in the kitchen. It makes me happy every time I see it, not because it's good, but because it exists, and I made it. Ruth called every Sunday. I started a walking group for women over 60 in Granville. 11 women showed up on the first morning, and we walked 2 miles in the cold and stopped at a bakery. The group has 17 members now. We walk every week, and afterward we have coffee and talk about everything and nothing. I think Harold would have liked these women. As for Daniel and Krista, Callaway Property Group dissolved 8 months after the legal proceedings concluded. The asset freeze, the public court record, the collapsed deals, the business Daniel had spent 15 years building was gone. Not damaged. Gone. They sold their house in Cedarville and moved to a rental apartment near a Columbus Highway interchange. Daniel works in some administrative capacity for a larger real estate firm, kept at a distance from independent operation following the Ohio Division of Real Estate Review. Krista returned to work as a bookkeeper. Whatever shape their days had taken, those days were now shaped by necessity rather than ambition. Whether either of them examined the choices that brought them there, I genuinely don't know. I've made my peace with not knowing. My grandchildren I handled with care. I wrote them each a letter the year after the case, handwritten on good paper. I told them I loved them, that none of what happened was about them, and that when they were ready to talk, I would be here, and I would tell them the truth. Patrick is 16 now. He texted me on my birthday, just, "Happy birthday, Grandma," with a cake emoji. I looked at it for a long time. It meant the line was still open. Emma, who is 12, sent me a drawing last Christmas. A house with a garden, purple flowers in the front. Some things can't be repaired quickly. Some things can only be kept open, tended carefully, waited on with the patience of someone who has learned that time, given enough of it, tends toward honesty. I am still waiting. I am also, in the meantime, living, which is the best thing I can do for all of us. What I learned, what I would tell anyone who finds themselves sitting on a basement floor with a stranger's secret in their hands, is this: grief is not the same thing as weakness, and the people who love you, even after they are gone, are still on your side. I also learned that love and harm can come from the same person, and that understanding this does not require you to accept the harm. I did not stop loving Daniel when I filed the civil complaint, but I stopped allowing love to function as an excuse for injustice. And that distinction is one of the most important I've ever learned to make. To anyone who recognizes something in this story, a number that doesn't add up, a document you didn't fully understand, a family member who keeps telling you you're confused, please hear me. You are probably not confused. Trust the thing that hums. What would you have done in my place? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for listening. Harold would have liked you.